The bus door opened with a metallic hiss. Passengers hurriedly entered and exited, carrying bags, briefcases, and worries. The air was heavy, blending the smell of rain with the muffled sounds of conversations and the screech of brakes. Jason, a young man in his early 20s, stepped on with firm strides, his eyes quickly scanning for a seat. He wore a worn-out hoodie, and his headphones pulsed with music only he could hear. The impatience on his face made it clear he wasn't willing to stand for the ride. At the back of the bus sat Mr. Benson, a man with gray hair and an upright posture, holding a small bag containing a loaf of bread and an apple. His eyes, though tired, reflected serenity. He rode this same bus every day, a routine that for him was a moment of reflection amid the city's chaos. As the bus lurched forward, Jason positioned himself strategically near Mr. Benson. The journey had barely begun, but it was about to take an unexpected turn. The bus zigzagged hurriedly through the narrow streets, the screeching brakes echoing at every corner. Jason, gripping the overhead handle tightly, stared at Mr. Benson. His eyes radiated an impatient, almost uncontrollable irritation, while the elderly man sat calmly, gazing out the window. Jason couldn't hold back any longer. He leaned forward, his shadow looming over the older man. "Hey you," he snapped, his voice cutting through the air. "That seat's mine by right, you know. It's a priority seat. Can't you see?" A few passengers glanced sideways, but no one said a word. The silence among them heightened the tension, everyone waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Mr. Benson slowly turned his face, his eyes settling on Jason with a calm yet firm expression. His voice emerged like a whisper amidst the bus's commotion. "You're right, young man. This is a priority seat, but I, too, have my reasons for being here." Jason shook his head, irritated. "Reasons?" he scoffed, crossing his arms. "Look, old man, you're sitting there all relaxed while I've been on my feet after a full day of work. You really want to say you need that seat more than I do?" The nearby passengers began murmuring, but Mr. Benson remained composed. He adjusted the small bag on his lap and replied with the same tranquility. "I've worked my whole life, young man. Now, the fatigue is not just in my muscles, but in my bones." Jason stepped closer, his tone now laced with provocation. "Oh, so you're trying to teach me a lesson? Huh? Spare me? Old man, I'm serious. Get up before I lose my patience." The noise of the bus seemed to subside, as if even the vehicle recognized the gravity of the situation. The tension was palpable, the air inside the bus feeling like a taut wire about to snap. Mr. Benson looked at Jason again, his gaze unwavering. He didn't rise, nor did he buckle under the pressure. Instead, he replied firmly, "Maybe you need this seat for other reasons, young man, but if you think you can take what's not yours by force, learn this now. Respect isn't given, it's earned." Jason took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring. The atmosphere was thick, and the bus seemed to transform into a silent arena, with every eye fixed on the two men. The tension reached its peak, poised to erupt into something more significant. The silence inside the bus was suffocating. Jason continued to stare at Mr. Benson, waiting for a reaction that never came. As the young man swayed with the vehicle's motion, the elderly man remained steady, as if rooted to that seat. Mr. Benson's tranquility felt like a provocation. Despite the taunts, he neither raised his voice nor showed any sign of anger or impatience. This unsettling calmness began to subtly but powerfully disarm Jason. "You think staying quiet is going to solve anything?" Jason challenged, his voice laden with frustration. "I just want what's mine by right." Mr. Benson lifted his head, his eyes locking with Jason's. His expression was serene, but there was an invisible strength in it, as though he carried decades of accumulated wisdom. He waited a few seconds before responding, his voice low yet firm enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Son, sometimes silence speaks louder than 1,000 words." Jason scoffed, taking a step back. His defensive posture revealed that he hadn't expected such a response. "Oh, so that's just an excuse to dodge the conversation, huh?" he retorted, crossing his arms. Mr. Benson smiled faintly, but it wasn't a mocking smile. It was the kind of smile from someone who understood the restlessness of the young man before him. He adjusted the bag on his lap and spoke with an unsettling calmness. Dodge the conversation? No, my boy. I've faced challenges far greater than this. A seat on the bus isn't worth fighting over. Jason remained silent for a few seconds, clearly taken aback by the response. Mr. Benson's gentle tone didn't align with the confrontation Jason had anticipated. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. Easy for you to say, huh? I bet you've never had to deal with what I go through every day. Mr. Benson tilted his head slightly, as if trying to see beyond Jason's words. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. Maybe you're right, but let me tell you something. I've lived through days when all I had was hope and willpower. And do you know what I learned? It's not always strength that resolves things. Sometimes it's patience. Jason frowned, confused. Patience, he repeated, almost as if the word itself were an insult. And what does patience have to do with this? The elderly man placed one hand on the seat back and looked around the bus, as though speaking not just to Jason, but to everyone present. Patience teaches us that every hard moment can bring a lesson. You're angry, and I understand. But before you demand something from someone, ask yourself, is this really necessary? Is it worth hurting another person over something so small? The weight of Mr. Benson's words hung in the air, echoing in the bus's silence. Jason averted his gaze, his face showing a mixture of shame and discomfort. The old man's words seemed to have struck a deep chord, though Jason wasn't ready to admit it. Even so, Mr. Benson didn't push further. He simply leaned back in his seat, looking out the window again, as if the incident didn't matter. The calm way he handled the situation was his greatest weapon, a quiet resilience that stood in stark contrast to Jason's impulsiveness. The bus continued its journey, and while Mr. Benson's words hadn't ended the conflict, they had planted a seed. Jason felt it, even if he didn't want to acknowledge it. Jason breathed heavily, unable to contain the frustration bubbling within him. Mr. Benson's words echoed in his mind like a silent challenge, and the older man's serenity only heightened his impatience. Clenching his fists, Jason stepped forward. "Listen here, old man," Jason shouted, his voice now laced with irritation. "You think you can teach me something? I'm tired of people like you acting like you know it all." The bus jolted as it hit a pothole, causing some passengers to grab onto the rails for balance. At that moment, Lucy, a young woman in her early 20s, calmly rose from her seat at the front row. Her bright, determined eyes and confident posture immediately drew everyone's attention. She walked toward Jason and Mr. Benson, her presence adding to the tension, but also filling the air with a sense of anticipation. Her gaze was steady, carrying a calm confidence that seemed to demand attention. "Jason, right?" she said, her voice firm but not aggressive. Jason eyed her warily, his brow furrowed. "Who are you to butt in?" he snapped, his voice still tinged with irritation. Lucy crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Someone who's tired of watching you take out your anger on the wrong person." Jason blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. "Take out my anger?" he repeated with a humorless laugh. "Oh great, here comes a psychologist." Lucy didn't back down. Instead, she took a small step closer, closing the distance between them. "Listen to me for a minute, Jason," she began, her tone softening but still carrying authority. "You're angry, that's obvious. But your anger has nothing to do with him." Jason opened his mouth to retort, but Lucy raised her hand, signaling she wasn't done. "Look around," she continued, gesturing toward the other passengers silently observing. "Everyone here is exhausted. Everyone's carrying something. But just because you're having a bad day doesn't mean you have the right to take it out on someone who's done nothing to you." Jason hesitated, her words seeming to seep through his defenses. He fidgeted with his hoodie, trying to find something to occupy his hands. "What do you know about what I'm going through?" he muttered, his voice quieter now. Lucy smiled slightly, not a triumphant smile, but one of understanding. "Maybe I don't know exactly," she admitted. "But I know that when you stop fighting everyone and start looking inward, things become a lot clearer." Jason remained silent, his hands now resting by his sides. The other passengers watched closely, as though this moment were a pivotal scene in a drama unfolding before them. Lucy turned to Mr. Benson, giving him a small nod as if asking for permission to continue. The elderly man smiled faintly and nodded back, his gaze filled with approval. She refocused on Jason. "So tell me, Jason," she asked, her tone almost challenging. "What are you really looking for here? A seat? Or someone to blame for how you're feeling?" Jason didn't answer right away. He seemed to wrestle internally, debating whether to keep arguing or listen to what Lucy was saying. His body was still tense, but the intensity in his eyes had softened slightly. The bus turned a corner, and for a brief moment, silence reigned once again. Lucy stood her ground, patiently waiting for Jason's response, while Mr. Benson observed the scene with an air of wisdom. Jason fumbled with the zipper of his hoodie, his restless fingers betraying the conflict raging inside him. He averted his gaze, trying to escape the weight of the moment, but Lucy's steady presence pulled him back. "I'm not looking for anything," he muttered at last, his tone more defensive than genuine. Lucy tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. Her voice softened, but remained purposeful. "Jason, everyone's looking for something, even if they don't realize it," she said, crossing her arms again. "Sometimes it's just a little respect. Sometimes we just want to be heard." Jason glanced at her briefly, then quickly looked down at the floor. "Respect?" He scoffed with a bitter laugh. "No one's ever given me that, so why should I give it to anyone?" A murmur rippled through the bus. Some passengers shook their heads in disapproval, while others seemed to finally understand the weight behind Jason's explosive behavior. Lucy, however, remained focused on him, her face showing empathy rather than judgment. "Maybe you're right," Lucy admitted, her tone now more intimate, as if speaking directly to Jason's heart. "Maybe life hasn't been fair to you, but do you know what I've learned? You don't earn respect by shouting, demanding, or forcing it. You earn it by showing who you really are, even when no one's watching." Jason closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as though trying to block out Lucy's words. But they seemed to bypass his defenses, lodging themselves in his mind. "Easy for you to say, huh?" he retorted, though his voice lacked its earlier intensity. Lucy gave him a small, understanding smile. "No, Jason, it's not easy," she said, glancing briefly at the other passengers as if to include them in the conversation. "No one here has an easy life. Every person on this bus has their struggles, their pain. But what matters is how we choose to handle them. You can keep taking your anger out on people like Mr. Benson, or you can use that anger to change something within yourself." Jason raised his head, finally meeting Lucy's gaze with a more attentive expression. Her eyes held a determination that he didn't know how to confront. For the first time, he seemed to truly listen. Lucy took a small step closer, her tone now almost maternal. "You're young, Jason. You have time to learn, to grow. But it starts with small choices, like this one right here. No one's against you. The world's hard enough without us turning on those who just want to get by in peace." The bus jolted again, and Jason took a step back, leaning against one of the bars. He let out a heavy sigh, as though tired not just physically, but emotionally. "So you're saying I'm wrong for wanting to sit?" he asked, but this time his voice was hesitant, almost as if seeking reassurance. Lucy shook her head slowly. "No, Jason, wanting to sit isn't wrong. But humiliating someone to get it? That might be." Jason remained silent, his hands now hanging loosely at his sides. The weight of Lucy's words seemed to be breaking through the barriers he'd built around himself. Lucy, sensing she'd made an impact, stepped back slightly and glanced at Mr. Benson, who had stayed silent throughout the exchange. The elderly man raised his eyebrows and offered a slight smile, as if recognizing wisdom in action. Jason finally ran a hand through his hair and looked at the seat he had been so adamant about claiming. His expression softened, and he seemed ashamed of his own behavior. The silence on the bus was now different, not tense or heavy, but reflective. Every passenger felt that something important had taken place. Lucy remained nearby, watching Jason with patience. She knew change didn't happen instantly, but the first step was crucial, and Jason seemed to be taking it, however hesitantly. Jason began, but his voice faltered. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Maybe I overreacted, all right?" Mr. Benson, still calm, tilted his head slightly, and responded with a gentle smile. Admitting that is already a big step, son. Jason felt exposed, but also relieved. Vulnerability wasn't something he was used to, and this small exchange felt more significant than he'd expected. He continued, his voice carrying both hesitation and regret. I'm tired, of everything. I work all day, pay my bills, and it feels like it's never enough. Every day is the same. Lucy nodded, her expression showing that she understood every word. I know how that feels, Jason, she said softly. But what you're feeling isn't just physical exhaustion, is it? It's that kind of tiredness that comes from within, like the world is crushing you. Jason nodded slowly, finally feeling that someone truly understood him, that his emotions weren't just meaningless outbursts. Yeah, that's exactly it, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. It feels like no one cares. Mr. Benson smiled gently and replied with a tranquility that seemed almost paternal. We've all been there, son. The difference is that some of us learn to carry the weight without letting it define us. Jason looked at the elderly man, now paying full attention. He saw something in Mr. Benson's eyes, not just calmness, but a silent strength built over years of challenges and perseverance. How do you do it? Jason asked, almost in a whisper. Mr. Benson placed the small bag on his lap and said, Life has taken a lot from me, Jason, but I decided not to let it take my peace. It's a choice you make every single day. Jason stayed quiet, processing the words. The bus stopped at a red light, and the afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the older man's face. The moment felt symbolic, an invitation for Jason to see life from a new perspective. Lucy, sensing that Jason needed one final nudge, took a small step forward. Jason, she said gently, sometimes all we need is a pause, a moment to breathe, reflect, and remember that we're not alone on this journey. Jason bit his lower lip, clearly emotional but trying to hide it. He ran his hands over his face and shook his head, as if trying to rid himself of the internal turmoil. I've never thought about it that way before, he admitted, his tone a mix of surprise and humility. Lucy smiled, her eyes sparkling with satisfaction. Sometimes, all it takes is someone showing us a different angle, she said softly. Jason glanced at Mr. Benson, and for the first time during the ride, he didn't see the elderly man as an obstacle, but as a source of wisdom. He exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders visibly easing. Then, to everyone's surprise, he made a decision. You know what? Jason said with a small, almost sheepish smile. You can keep the seat, sir. I think I'll be fine standing. The atmosphere inside the bus, which had felt like a pressure cooker moments before, finally relaxed. Passengers let out small sighs of relief and exchanged approving glances. Some even smiled discreetly, clearly pleased with the outcome. Mr. Benson nodded to Jason, his smile full of gratitude. Thank you, son. That's a wise choice. Jason leaned against one of the bus's poles, glancing between Lucy and Mr. Benson. For the first time, he felt as though he'd taken a small but meaningful step in the right direction. The bus continued its journey, but something had shifted within Jason. He knew this wasn't the end of his struggles, but rather the beginning of a transformation he hadn't expected, one sparked by a simple bus ride. Lucy remained close, watching him with patient understanding. She knew that change didn't come all at once, but she could see that Jason was starting to reflect on his actions. The first step, even a small one, was always the hardest, and Jason had taken it. Jason sighed again, leaning against the pole. His gaze softened as he looked at Mr. Benson, who still sat calmly, his hands resting on the small bag in his lap. Hey, Jason said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. Thanks for, not losing your cool back there. Mr. Benson smiled warmly. Patience comes with time, son, he said. And sometimes it's the best way to show strength. Jason nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The weight he had been carrying still lingered, but it felt a little lighter now. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in his journey. As the bus rolled on, the sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing everyone in a warm, golden glow. It was a small moment, but for Jason, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. one where respect and understanding could pave the way for a better path forward.